They're your responsibility now. My sister left me a note with her abandoned kids. I contacted CPS. Now she was arrested and the kids. My name's Jake. I'm 28 and I work at an insurance company in the city. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. I'm doing okay now, own a small apartment, have my own car, and I'm not really in debt. But things weren't always like this. Growing up, I was the responsible one. While my friends were out partying or hanging out with their families, I was in my room studying, trying to make my parents proud. But they never seemed to notice, at least not in the way I wanted them to. My sister Amber was always the golden child. Everything she did was amazing. She got a C in a class. It's okay, she tried her best. Dropped out of college. Not everyone is cut out for school. Got married at 19. Such a beautiful young love. Meanwhile, there I was, busting my ass to get straight A's, working part-time jobs to save up for college, and hoping just once that my parents would recognize what I was doing. But no matter how hard I worked, it was always about Amber. It didn't take me long to realize that I wasn't going to get the same attention, the same praise, no matter what I did. So I kept my head down and kept pushing. I wasn't looking for approval anymore. I just wanted to get out of that house and make something of myself. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it without needing them. The first big milestone came when I got my acceptance letter to college. I'd worked my ass off to get a partial scholarship to study business, and my grandma on my dad's side had left me a little bit of money for school. It wasn't much, but it would have been enough to cover the rest of my tuition. It was everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed of. So I ran home that day, heart pounding in excitement. I thought maybe this time, maybe now, my parents would finally see me, finally be proud of me. But when I walked in, my mom was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. My dad was slouched in his chair, barely paying attention. I felt my chest tighten as I held up the letter. "Look, I got in. I'm going to college." My mom glanced at it. "That's nice, honey," she said, distracted by her phone. That was it. That was all I got. I couldn't even process it before my dad turned off the TV and sat up straighter. I knew that tone in his voice. It was never a good sign. "We need to talk about your college fund," he said, and I froze. The excitement drained out of me like air from a balloon. "What about it?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "Well," he started, not looking at me, "we had to use that money for something else." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. "What do you mean? That money was for my education. Grandma left it to me for this." He didn't meet my eyes. "Amber's wedding is coming up and we had to spend it on that. Weddings are expensive, you know." I just stared at him, trying to wrap my mind around it. They had taken my college fund, the money Grandma saved specifically for me, and spent it on Amber's second wedding. I couldn't believe it. She was getting married for the second time, and they were willing to spend my future on her wedding. I couldn't hold it back. I started yelling, asking how they could do this to me, how they could prioritize Amber over my future. My mom tried to defend herself, saying I was being selfish. "You should be happy for Amber, she needs our support." I snapped. "I've spent my whole life trying to make you proud, and this is what I get. You take my future to pay for Amber's second wedding." My voice cracked, and I was shaking with anger. My dad sat there, silent, like he always did when things got messy. He never defended me, he just sat back, uncomfortable with conflict. So I did what I needed to do. I packed my bags that night, took whatever I could fit in my car, and drove away. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I drove to my Aunt Rachel's place. She was my mom's sister, but my parents barely talked to her because she wasn't afraid to call them out on their bullshit. She'd always treated me with respect, unlike my parents, who never seemed to care. After graduation, I finally started getting my life together. I got a job at a decent insurance firm, found a place of my own, and honestly, life started to look up. Things were moving in the right direction. But there was one thing I never really dealt with, my family. I hadn't talked to my parents in 8 years, and Amber, she hadn't even tried to reach out to me. I was just gone. Then, after all the silence, I got a call from Aunt Rachel on Christmas Eve. She said my parents showed up at her house. I didn't want to answer, but I did. "They're here, Jake. They want to talk to you," Aunt Rachel said. "They say it's about Amber." Of course, it was about Amber. It always was. I knew they would eventually come crawling back when they needed something from me. But this time, I wasn't sure I could handle it. I told Aunt Rachel I'd be over, and I didn't want to meet them at this time. When I arrived at Aunt Rachel's house, I immediately knew something was off. There were too many coats hanging by the door, too many shoes, and I could hear my mom's laugh, too loud, too familiar. I froze in the doorway. Amber's voice. My heart sank. They were here, sitting in Aunt Rachel's living room like it was just another holiday get-together. I didn't even know how to process it. 8 years of silence, and now they were here, acting like we were just picking up where we left off. I could feel my stomach twist. My mom rushed toward me, arms open wide. "Jake, you look so good." I stepped back, avoiding the hug. "What are you doing here?" The words came out before I could stop them. "It's Christmas, sweetheart," she said like it was a simple answer. "Family should be together." Family, the word felt hollow coming from her lips. After everything they'd done, after everything I'd been through, they still thought that showing up unannounced and demanding my help was okay. I turned to Aunt Rachel, who was standing in the background looking helpless. I knew she was trying to hold it all together, but she had no control over what my parents had done. She stepped forward, looking apologetic. "They just showed up an hour ago. I tried to call, but your phone—" "Well, I tried. They insisted they had to talk to you, and you know how your mom gets when she wants something." I looked over at Amber, who was sitting with her kids. She barely acknowledged me. She didn't care. And then I saw it, my mom, my dad, acting like this was normal, like everything was fine. After all these years, they just showed up. They didn't care about the years I spent trying to get their attention, trying to be the perfect son. Now they wanted my help. "What do you want?" I asked, feeling the cold rush of anger mix with the confusion in my chest. Mom's smile faltered, but she didn't back down. "It's Amber. She's going through something." I didn't even let her finish. I already knew where this was going. "Amber, again? What now?" I could feel the anger bubbling up. I didn't even care who heard it. "Amber needs help. She's been through some changes lately," Mom continued with that same rehearsed line. "Her marriage is falling apart again. We need your help, Jake." I froze. "What kind of help?" "Amber's kids need a place to stay for a while," Dad's voice interrupted. He was sitting in the same armchair he always sat in, his hands clasped together like he was trying to look serious. But there was no real authority in his voice. "You've got a good life now, a stable life." "Stable?" I snapped. "You mean I'm the fallback option?" Amber didn't even look at me. She was busy playing with her kids, ignoring the whole situation. It was like she didn't even care what was going on. I could feel the heat in my face as I tried to hold it together. "Just take them in, Jake," Mom insisted. "They need a home right now. Amber needs time. She's been through a lot." I couldn't believe it. After everything they had done to me, they were asking me to raise Amber's kids, to fix her mess again. I was trying to hold myself back from exploding, but every word they said pushed me closer to the edge. "No," I finally said, shaking my head. "Not like this, not after everything. You're seriously asking me to just take them in like I'm some kind of, I don't know, safety net." Mom looked at me, her face twisting. "You should want to help." "I don't want to help you anymore," I said, more harshly than I meant to. "I'm not doing this. You can't just waltz back in after 8 years and expect me to fix your mess, fix Amber's mess. It's not my responsibility anymore." I felt like the walls were closing in. I was so angry, so hurt. But there was a part of me that still wanted to help, to fix everything. It wasn't just about Amber anymore, it was about those kids. They didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess, but I wasn't sure if I could be the one to fix it. I wasn't prepared to take on Amber's problems. I walked into the kitchen, needing to clear my head. I felt suffocated by it all. Everything that had happened in the past, everything that still haunted me, felt like it was crashing down on me at that moment. The emotional breaking point hit when I walked back into the living room. Amber wasn't there, but what I saw made my stomach drop. A note, casually placed on the coffee table. "They're your responsibility now." Amber. She had left her kids with me, just like that. She had walked away from her own children, abandoned them without a second thought. I was furious, shaking with rage, but I didn't let it show. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, burning my throat. The tears threatened to spill, but I refused to let myself break down in front of everyone. Amber had done this. Amber had put me in this position. I didn't ask for this. I turned to look at Ben and Lisa. They were sitting there, frozen, looking at me with those wide, frightened eyes. Ben was quiet, his face full of uncertainty. Lisa, on the other hand, was clinging to me with small, trembling hands. I didn't know what to say to them, but I had to say something. "It's going to be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince them or myself. They were so young, but they'd already seen too much. No kid should have to endure what they'd been through. What kind of mother just abandons her kids like that? She had always been this way, always looking for the next easy escape, never considering anyone else. And now, she was gone, off living her life while her kids were left in my hands, her last option. I could hear my parents in the other room. They hadn't followed me yet, probably giving me some space to deal with everything. I didn't want to hear their excuses. I knew what they'd say. "She's under a lot of stress," they'd argue, or worse, she didn't know what she was doing. I knew Amber had made a choice, just like she always had, and I wasn't about to let her drag me down again. I looked down at Ben, who still hadn't said a word. He looked so resigned, like he had grown used to this, used to being the one who had to hold things together. My heart broke a little for him. "Ben," I said softly, crouching down to meet his eyes, "it's not your job to take care of your sister. I'm here now. You don't have to worry about her anymore." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope that quickly faded as he nodded quietly. I could tell that he didn't fully trust me yet. He didn't trust anyone. It was going to take time, but I was determined to be the one who proved to him that he could trust again, that this wasn't just another false promise. I handed her Amber's note. "She left them," I said flatly, still trying to process what had just happened. Aunt Rachel was stunned, unable to believe what I was saying. "She really left them?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. I didn't know where to start. Amber had left them with nothing, no plan, no food, no support. She had disappeared, and here I was, trying to figure out how to care for two kids who had just been thrown into this mess. I felt completely out of my depth. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't going to let them go back to Amber. I couldn't. Aunt Rachel must have seen the look on my face because she stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "Jake," she said gently, "you don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out together." Her words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized that no matter how messed up everything had gotten, no matter how much Amber had screwed everything up, I was the one who had to step up. The first few days after Amber dropped off her kids were a complete blur. I didn't know what to do, where to turn, or how to make it all feel real. I'd spent my entire life in the shadow of my sister's choices, trying to get recognition for my accomplishments, while she just floated through life without consequence. But now, she'd crossed a line that I could never ignore, and now they were stuck with me. I couldn't just pretend that everything was fine. I knew I had to step up for them. I had to be the one to fix this mess. I didn't have a choice anymore. I went straight into action. I called the legal offices I knew and contacted Child Protective Services, CPS, to make sure everything was documented properly. Amber had abandoned her kids. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I gathered all the evidence, the security footage, the note she left, the fact that she hadn't made any attempt to contact her children for days. CPS moved quickly. They came to assess the situation, interviewing the kids, taking photos, documenting everything. The fact that Amber was gone, that she had dropped her kids off and vanished, was a clear sign of her negligence. It wasn't the first time she'd abandoned them. Ben and Lisa had been through so much more than any child should have to go through. The more I learned about Amber's actions, the angrier I got. How could she be so careless? How could she throw her children aside like they were nothing more than a burden? I wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. I filed for temporary guardianship, not because I felt sorry for her, but because those kids needed stability. They needed someone to protect them. It hit me harder than I expected. Being legally responsible for Ben and Lisa wasn't something I had planned on, but here I was, dealing with all the fallout of Amber's actions. And my parents? They were still making excuses for her. When my parents showed up at my house after hearing about Amber's arrest, I was ready to lose it. They didn't come to check on the kids. They came to guilt-trip me. They came to tell me that family should stick together, and that I shouldn't be so hard on Amber. They acted like I should just forgive her and take the kids in without a second thought. "Jake, you've always been the strong one," my dad said. "You've always been the one who could handle everything. You can't just turn your back on your sister now." I had to swallow my anger. My parents still didn't get it. They were still excusing Amber's behavior. And now, after all these years of neglect, they expected me to pick up the pieces. "No, Dad," I said firmly. "This is the last time I'm cleaning up her mess." Amber wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had spent my whole life trying to please them, trying to be the son they could be proud of. But this was different. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Ben and Lisa, and I wasn't going to let them down. I made it clear to my parents that I was not going to let Amber get away with abandoning her children. I wasn't going to sweep this under the rug like they had done with her other mistakes. I filed the legal paperwork for custody, and I contacted CPS about their next steps. Amber's fate was sealed. The legal consequences she faced were unavoidable. CPS had already started their investigation, and they were pulling no punches. Child abandonment, neglect, and endangerment, those were the charges she was facing. Amber tried to reach out to me a few times, sending messages full of excuses and self-pity. She texted me about how tough things had been for her and how sorry she was. But she never once mentioned her kids. She didn't ask about how Ben and Lisa were doing or how they were adjusting to this new life. I didn't respond. When Amber was arrested in Las Vegas and brought back to face the charges, I realized something. She was never going to change. She had always been selfish, always looking for ways to escape responsibility. The woman who had once been my sister was now a stranger to me. She wasn't the person I grew up with. She wasn't the person who could be counted on to take care of her own children. I kept my focus on the kids. They needed stability, so I worked with CPS to ensure that they got the proper care and legal protection. I filed for full guardianship, and the court granted it. The judge agreed that Amber was unfit to care for them, and they placed her kids under my care temporarily. The court also set a psychological evaluation for Amber. She had to undergo therapy and parenting classes if she ever wanted the chance to get her kids back. But it wasn't looking good. And I knew deep down that, even if she did try, it would never be enough. 6 months later, things started to settle. Ben and Lisa were finally adjusting to their new lives. They were in therapy, and I made sure they were enrolled in school. I never imagined I'd be a father figure to them, but I knew I had to be. I had to be the one they could depend on. Amber's trial went on, and she eventually pled guilty to child abandonment and neglect. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 months. The judge also terminated her parental rights. It was a hard pill to swallow, knowing that Amber would never be a mother to them again, but it was the only way they could have a future without the constant threat of being abandoned again. My parents tried to get in touch. They apologized, but their apologies felt empty. They tried to say they understood what I had gone through, but they didn't. They never would. Amber was always the golden child, the one they protected, the one they excused. The weeks following Amber's sentencing were quiet, almost unnervingly so. It felt like everything had settled, and for the first time in years I could breathe. But that quiet also gave me space to think, really think, about everything that had happened. The kids were still adjusting. Ben was starting to smile again, which felt like a small victory in itself. He was so serious all the time, too cautious for a 7-year-old. He wasn't the carefree kid I had hoped he would be, but slowly we were finding our rhythm. I made sure they were in therapy, and I made a point to be present. I wasn't about to repeat the mistakes of my past. I wasn't going to make them feel like their lives were being held together by strings. I didn't know where life would take us, but for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. I wasn't looking for an apology from my parents. I didn't need them to suddenly realize the damage they had done. I had moved on from that.